Here's the agenda for today's lesson. We're going to start with a presentation from Rachael Long and then continue on to Olivia Smith. And then we'll have an opportunity to field any additional questions and hopefully get some participants, some of you, to tell us your experience with birds and farm and food safety. And then we'll wrap up with a conclusion. So I think folks are filling out that poll there already. We'll give them a couple more minutes. And Rachael, if you wanted to get your presentation ready, I think we can get things started here.
Hey. Okay. Great. Can everybody see that okay? Great, thank you. Well, let's see. Gosh, I just wanted to say welcome, everybody, and it's good to be here. And I just wanted to thank Brian, Shelley, and Joanne for organizing this program as well. Brian, did you want to continue with the poll, or can I hit? Or I guess I can hit close. There we go. Okay, thank you. So for this talk, what I'm going to do is share a little bit about the benefits of field edge habitat on farms, as well as food safety issues. And this is work that I've been doing for about the past 30 years. And my interest really is in looking at ways to encourage more ecosystem services on farms. For example, bringing in swallows that could help with feeding on insect pests. Can people still hear me okay? Am I still on? Hello?
Yes, you're
okay, great.
Yep,
okay, good.
Because
I see that everything was frozen, so I apologize. So when we take a look at our much of our farmlands from a bird's eye view, it's extensive monocultures in many parts of our world, and this is the Sacramento Valley where I work, and you can see the almonds with that checkerboard right there, and you have wheat, and then you have some of these fields that are still getting ready to be planted for, like tomatoes and sunflower and safflower and such. But with our drought, gosh, short on water. When we take a look at the ground level, that this is what most of our field edges look like, very degraded. And this provides tremendous opportunities to do some field edge plantings. For example, this is elderberry that's adjacent to a processing tomato field. And when we have these types of habitat on the field edges, we do get all these benefits listed here on the left. And I'm actually going to go through these and talk about some of the work that we've done in each of these areas to really show why these field edge habitats are so critically important and needed on farms for enhancing biodiversity and nature-based solutions for issues like pest control and pollination services. So I think one of my favorites is that field edge habitats actually enhance biodiversity, in particular for birds. This is a western bluebird with looks like a armyworm in its beak. And when we have field edges like this one here, this is the redbud, wonderful purple flowers in the springtime. And when we go from bare or weedy field edges to tree lines, hedgerows, riparian areas, that we do find that you get an increase in bird abundance, and also a lot more different species. And birds are critically important for helping control pests in adjacent crops. For example, Sasha Heath and I did some work in walnuts that Joanne presented earlier, that we found that these birds can help to control one of the key codling moth pests in walnuts by just feeding on the larvae during the wintertime. So one of the concerns that I do hear is that people say, well, if I put in habitat, am I going to get a lot of flocking birds coming to my farm? And the answer is no. And the reason why is because when we take a look at field edge habitat on a larger landscape scale, it is just too small to be a source of for pest birds to really focus in on that particular small area. So, for example, this is a hedgerow that we've done a lot of our work in, adjacent to tomatoes. And when you look at it aerially, you can just see where that yellow star is. That's that hedgerow. And so your flocking birds are not queuing in on that. They're queuing in on the crop. And we also found that really if you don't have any habitat anywhere, there's nowhere else for the birds to go. And so essentially they're going to go into your crop. So providing habitat is really important, but you're not for attracting in birds, but you're not going to get huge numbers of flocking birds. They're going for the crop. And we do need to think a little bit more about when birds might be beneficial and when they could be pests. A lot of our birds, like starlings and blackbirds, that they feed on insects early in the season because they need to feed their young, their fledglings, their babies, a high energy source. So they're going for insects. But later in the season, they'll switch to seed crops. And so you might think about, what are ways to deter the birds when they're not wanted? And my colleagues at the Tule Lake Research and Extension Center up in Klamath area, Northern California, that they've resorted to using this waving inflatable man. The red, white, and blue really seems to push away a lot of the blackbirds, and that helps to protect the cereal grain trials, that like the wheat trials that are done up in this area through UC research. And the only problem they've had is where the generator goes out, and and basically that it collapses. So we also looked at rodents and other mammals associated with field edge habitat. And again, the rodent population and the mammals are not focusing in on those small hedgerows where that yellow star is. They're moving around landscapes at a much, much larger level. So, for example, if we end up disking up the field to the right of the star, all the rodents that are there are going to move through the hedgerow and into the adjacent crops. And just to share that, that we did a huge study looking at rodents and other mammals in field edges where you have hedgerows and where you don't have hedgerows. We worked in walnuts and we worked in tomatoes. That bottom left is a hedgerow of Toyon Christmasberry, beautiful red berries in the fall. On the right is the control plots. And what we had is we put out game cameras and we put out live traps. We use these called Sherman traps, where we trapped rodents live. And after we trapped them, we dropped them into a little bag, and then we collected their fecal pellets, and then we actually released them back out in the field. So these were all live trapping that we did. And what we found is that you find rodents everywhere. You find them in those control areas where it's just weedy. You find them in the hedgerows. You find them in the field. It didn't matter whether you had a hedgerow or didn't have a hedgerow. You still had rodents out there everywhere that need to be managed. And this is just this list of these different mammals that we found in the control areas conventionally managed in the light bars versus the hedgerow where you had habitat. And what you can see is throughout is just, sort of equal numbers. So these mammals are using these landscapes at a much larger level. The only one that was an exception was the desert cottontail rabbits. And these are only found where you have some sort of cover, like trees or elderberries or some sort of shrubs, that they really like that cover, and they can be damaging. And so you need to pay attention to these rabbits in that cover, because we farm in the Sac Valley, and we had 5 acres of our sunflowers taken down by jackrabbits, actually, which so it wasn't associated with the hedgerow for jackrabbits, but for cottontails, I've seen that's a problem. But we collected fecal pellets from almost 500 different rodents. And we know they were unique because we ear tagged them. And so each time we trapped them, sometimes we would trap the same one over and over again. We actually started naming them because, they would just be caught in the same trap day after day, like Fatty or King Rat or the one-eyed giant. And so, but in any case, that that these rodents do live out there, but we never found any E. coli, and salmonella was essentially 5%, or not 5%, 0.5%, 0.5%. That's 0.5%, and the average background is about 3%. So we were well below what naturally occurs out there. It just you do have these these salmonella that just is out there, but we were so much lower. I think it was only 2 out of almost 500 that showed any sort of issues, and not associated with the hedgerow. So we teamed up with the UC Davis Center for Food Safety on the study. They are actually co-authors on our paper, and basically they said that hedgerows are not a food safety risk on farms because they really are too small on a larger landscape scale to drive rodent populations and food safety issues. So I just wanted to then go through, I just have a few more minutes, I think, to go through the rest of my talk, and just wanted to share a few other benefits of hedgerows. Certainly weed suppression, that these hedgerow plantings will help out compete the weeds. And you do also get some birds, especially white-crowned sparrows, that will move in and out of these hedgerows, and they'll help to feed on these seedlings, weed seedlings as well. But that brings up to mind that when you're planting a crop, like a seedling, direct seeded crop next to a hedgerow, don't put it right close to the hedgerow, because you will have these birds come out and feed on seedlings. They'll move out, a couple of feet. They don't really like the open area, but they will feed on those seedlings. And just that a lot of weeds actually carry pests and diseases, and the hedgerows really provide a nice way of replacing that weedy vegetation that has a lot of pests. Native vegetation just doesn't have pests. You're not going to find these significant crop pests in oak trees or in Ceanothus, California lilac and such. So great replacement vegetation. And erosion control, deep roots of grasses can help to hold the soil. The loggerhead shrike, I only see it in hedgerows, and of course it's insectivorous as well as, I guess, feeding on other critters. Filter traps that these actually hedgerows that, for example, are in these ditches, drainage ditches, can trap pesticides, nutrients, sediments. I love the great blue herons that I see out there, that they will feast on gophers. And in our work, we actually found that that you do see a reduction in sediments and sediment-associated pollutants like phosphorus and pyrethroids associated with having vegetated drainage ditches. Carbon sequestration. We're just finishing up a project looking at carbon sequestration in the hedgerows. 36% more carbon in hedgerows than adjacent farmed edges. The researcher on this, lead researcher, is Jessica Chiartis, who just got her PhD at UC Davis, and she has a terrific new website on healthy soils, and the above ground diversity probably matches the below ground diversity in terms of finding all sorts of critters below ground, such as this robin that's eating a earthworm. Natural enemies that we know that hedgerows of flowering plants attract in huge numbers of natural enemies of pests. For example, the lacewings and parasitoid wasps that are big aphid feeders, and even the ladybugs, that the hedgerows of flowering plants provide the floral resources, nectar and pollen, that many of these beneficial insects need to survive and reproduce. For example, even our predators, the ladybugs, will go down into the flowers and feed on nectar and pollen during times of prey scarcity. And these hedgerows are actually exporting these natural enemies out into the adjacent crops, where they are helping out with pest control. So those farmers that have hedgerows don't have to spray quite as much for pest control as farmers that don't have any sort of flowering plants around their farms. So that's a savings right there. We also know that that pollinators frequent these hedgerows. This is California lilac, ceanothus, one of my favorite plants because it's also a nitrogen fixer. And a lot of our bees, the bumblebee on the left, the halictid or the leafcutter bee on the right, and these are feeding on, of course, the pollen and nectar, and they also move into adjacent crops where they help to pollinate the crops for better crop production. And I just wanted to put this graph out to show that we've actually measured profit associated with pest control and pollination services with these hedgerows. So we have profit on the y-axis and year after restoration on the x-axis down at the bottom, and it costs about $4,000 to establish a hedgerow. And the black line is the return on the investment for pest control only. The green line is the return on investment for pest control and pollination services. So for pest control alone, it would take about 15 years to start showing a profit in terms of the costs for establishing the hedgerow. So in other words, you do, as I mentioned, you have these natural enemies that are exported into the adjacent crops. They are feeding on pests. Farmers that have hedgerows don't have to spray quite as much. And so we're seeing a cost savings for pesticides in terms of not having to spray as much. And so it takes about 15 years to recoup the benefits there. But I think it's exciting with all this bird work that maybe, you know, the birds actually, we could put them into this model and show that we can get a return on the investment for the hedgerow even sooner, and adding in pollination services that we can actually get a return on the investment after 7 years, because you're getting a little bit better yields from the native bees. So just to finish, that there's lots of additional benefits of hedgerows. I really like the value added benefits, say, of elderberry and elderberry syrup and medicinal purposes that one might get for helping with the return on the investment, adding that into that model that I just showed. And I'd love to see our farmlands move to what is more like you find in England, with hedgerows all around the field edges, and all these nature-based solutions that can be provided by these just the habitat around farms in terms of pest control and pollination services, and attracting in birds that help feed on crop pests. So a lot of what I talked about is in this review paper that's published in California Agriculture, and also that the graph that I showed that shows the profit associated with hedgerows for pest control and pollination services. So thank you. I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. So if anything, you can continue sharing that screen just so folks, if they want to note down that information. And hopefully now too, there will be a new poll up on everyone's screen. It's called the quiz, but remember, these aren't graded. You're not going to have your responses, you know, publicly made or anything. These are just to see how well you're able to connect with some of the information Rachel presented on. And while you're filling that poll out, we did have a question come through, Rachel, and it was asked by Bill. And he has a notice that some orchards where they monitor owl boxes had pomegranates on the exterior fence lines that were used as pest anodes to protect their crops. Are these trees considered beneficial hedgerows?
I would say yes. I mean, I just happen to love native plants, especially now with issues of our drought, and they just tolerate, you know, very, very little water. But pomegranates flower, produce a lot of nectar and pollen, bring in a lot of birds and a lot of bees and natural enemies. So yes, definitely pomegranates are great. I love all the hummingbirds associated with the pomegranates.
And another question, just came through about, can hedgerows be harvested as well?
Yes,
So
that's
cropping within hedgerows.
yes, that's that's what I loved about the a value added product like elderberries and birds feed on elderberries too, but there just seems to be enough for everybody in terms of they can feed on the berries high up and because they get pretty big, and then one can harvest the berries down below. So yes, definitely a lot of opportunity for that.
Wonderful, thank you. And yeah, just a reminder, if you can
Mhm.
fill out this poll. Yeah, it's not great or anything. And so since there's no additional questions here, but we still have a little bit of time, can you just clarify a little bit maybe why you said you like native plants a bit
Oh yeah,
more in hedgerows?
so I prefer to have native plants in hedgerows because one is that they're more drought tolerant. That the pictures that I showed of like elderberry and ceanothus or California lilac and buckwheat, toyon or Christmas berry, coffee berry, that these plants that once they get started after a couple of years, that they're really resilient and they have deep roots that go way down to help during drought years like we're having right now in California. And the other thing is sometimes I've seen that people put in plants that are not like native to our area that then become weedy in adjacent fields. And so I just prefer the natives. But that said, there's some wonderful other plants, horticultural plants that could work well, but they're just going to often need more water.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that. Because Wild Farm Alliance, we are working, right, of course, about installing native habitats within farms. So stay with us into future lessons because we'll be introducing some new tools and pieces of information that'll help with planting those native hedgerow systems.
Right.
So we're going to wrap up the quiz now. Looks like most folks have
Yeah.
filled that out. And could you kind of just quickly, it looks like it was 100% correct, but
Yes,
can you
good.
just confirm what those
Sure.
questions were
So
asking?
the first one, does field edge habitat increase problems with flocking birds on farms? And everybody got that. The answer is no. They're just too small on a larger landscape scale to be a big player in attracting birds to farms. I hope everybody saw that picture of the aerial view. These hedgerows are just too small. And second, does field edge habitat increase the risk of foodborne pathogens on farms? Everybody got that? No, because again, they're too small. They're not a big player, and you have mammals and wildlife everywhere. They're not concentrating in the hedgerows. And actually, I was really disappointed. I thought I'd see all kinds of wonderful, mammals using those hedgerows, but they're just using the landscapes on a large, just a much larger level. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. So next we'll be moving on to Olivia and they will introduce themselves. And I want to remind folks that we will have another period of time after Olivia's presentation where we can continue to answer questions. And you can ask these questions for both Rachel and Olivia. So if any ideas pop up during Olivia's presentation about Rachel's talk, feel free to plug them in the chat and we'll get those answered. And so now it's your turn, Olivia. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. I'm excited to talk to you about some of my research on food safety. So I'll kind of dive more specifically into work on managing birds with regard to food safety risks. So first, what makes a bird a risk to food safety? The bird first needs to carry the foodborne pathogen. So you might be concerned about Salmonella, E. coli, or Campylobacter. And not only does the bird need to carry the pathogen, it also needs to deposit those pathogens on the crops. So this could be, like in this image, a starling defecating on your broccoli. And when both of these things are occurring, that the bird carries the pathogen and it's defecating on the crops, then the bird could be a problem of food safety. And so when we start to think about managing for this risk or understanding the risk, we can think about how different farm management and more farm neighborhood, larger scale processes impact each of these parts of the equation. So first I'll talk about some of our research on what we've seen is important in mediating if birds are carrying foodborne bacteria, as well as how often we've found these bacteria in bird feces. So how often do we find these bacteria in bird feces? We recently have done some work synthesizing studies conducted in produce farms across the West Coast. And we look across studies that tested bird feces for foodborne bacteria. What we find is that Campylobacter is the most common in about 8% of birds, but Salmonella and E. coli are pretty rare. So we found about 0.46% of bird feces had Salmonella. Then we specifically looked at one type of E. coli called Shiga toxin producing E. coli, and that was the rarest in 0.22% of birds. So birds aren't very commonly carrying Salmonella or E. coli on these farms, whereas Campylobacter is more common. And how do birds actually get these pathogens? They get them from the environment. So all of these bacteria are acquired by birds by eating them, and then other animals process them through their guts and deposit them back into the environment. So basically, birds need to come into contact with fecal matter. And what we found is that a pretty good place for birds to do that is at feedlots. So if there's an environment where there's a lot of fecal contamination, that's a risky place for birds to start to pick up these bacteria. And in other words, what we found is that birds are picking up bacteria in a large area. Rachel talked about this in the talk before me. So what we found is that, let's say that your farm is at the center of this circle, this little tiny yellow spot. Well, birds are pretty mobile and they're moving across a much wider area than just your farm typically. So birds can roam in this much larger area, which we call a landscape, is kind of the jargon term for it. And so birds are picking up bacteria from this much wider area. So what you're doing doesn't seem to be very important, and if birds are actually carrying the pathogen, but what your neighbors are doing is pretty important. So if you want to try to figure out how risky the birds on your farm might be to food safety, you need to assess what your neighbors are doing. So if you're at your farm and you look out and what you see is this photo all around you, the birds are probably not that risky on your farm. In natural forested environments, there's not much fecal contamination. And so birds are not being exposed to those bacteria. And the birds that tend to use forests also like to forage higher up in the canopies. So they're probably not coming down and contacting the fecal material. However, if you look out and what you see is this photo on the right, the birds on your farm are a lot more likely to be a problem. So if you're looking out from your farm and what you're seeing is this feedlot, those birds are probably picking up pathogens that they can bring onto your farm. And so we found that intensified livestock is pretty important for influencing food safety risk, but not all livestock are equally risky. So because birds are picking up these bacteria from a larger area, what you're doing on your farm, if you have, for example, this small sheep flock that you're using to kind of clean up your fields and fertilize them, that's probably not a big issue because birds are picking up these bacteria in a lot larger area. So I just talked a bit about what influences if birds have pathogens, which seems to be intensified livestock in a larger area. So the second part of thinking about the risks of birds to food safety is what influences if birds are actually depositing feces on the food. So there are a few things that you can think about to try to reduce the risk of birds depositing their feces on your crop. So first, don't plant produce eaten raw under wires or posts. And you can also think about using drip irrigation instead of sprinkler heads. So any farmer has probably seen this situation in this photo where robins and other birds really like to post on perches and wires. And so if they're kind of hanging out looking for prey, they might be defecating a bit on the crop. So I'm trying to think carefully about planting stuff like lettuce away from a power line can be one strategy to use. And then the next one, which Rachel talked about a bit as well, using bird deterrence. You could focus efforts around crops that are eaten raw. And from my understanding of the literature, these bird deterrent strategies aren't necessarily very effective. It's better to use a variety of approaches to deter the birds so they don't get acclimated to them. So use a variety and rotate them. And you can also think about attracting raptors. So if you've been attending the broader series, you might have seen the work on American kestrels. This is a kestrel nest box in the photo. And kestrels can scare away birds like robins and starlings because they're pretty territorial. And so if you have these raptors in the farm, they can deter these birds that you don't want, like starlings and blackbirds. And I have some work in progress actually examining if kestrels can improve food safety. So the idea, again, they are deterring birds that you don't want. And if there are fewer birds that you don't want, then there might be fewer feces on your crop. And I've so far done 1 year of data collection out of 2. I'm about to go out in a few weeks to finish the study. And what we found in the first year was that kestrels seem to be improving food safety. So we looked at cherry trees on farms that had active kestrels nesting and ones that didn't. And when kestrels were present, we found a lot fewer bird feces on the trees. And so kestrels might be a way that you can still conserve birds on your farm. They're a declining species of conservation concern, as well as improving food safety. And so trying to piece this together, what makes a bird a risk to food safety? Again, it needs to carry the pathogen and it needs to be pooping on your crops. And when both of those are occurring, it might be a risk to food safety. So what we found is that birds associated with feedlots seem to be the worst for food safety. And this figure is a little bit complicated, but I just want to draw your attention to a few things. So here vertically shows the number of birds per bird species in crop fields against the percent of birds that we found the most common foodborne pathogen, Campylobacter, in. And so if a bird is higher on both of those points, it's more of a risk to food safety. And so there's really kind of this front line of birds that seem to be more of a problem. And the dots, each of them represent a bird species. Those that are highly feedlot associated are orange, which you can see are all at the front. And then birds that are in purple are that ones that are sometimes found in feedlots, but not really commonly found. And then the green dots are species that are not found in feedlots. And what I want to point out is that this figure is actually showing about 140 bird species, but you're really just seeing a few dots, which means that a lot of the bird species on farms are not a huge risk to food safety, either because they're not commonly carrying the bacteria or because they're not commonly foraging on the crops. And so another way to think about it, birds need to deposit the bacteria on crops to make people sick. So you might have a group of birds that they may or may not carry these foodborne pathogens, but as long as they're in your hedge, say this tree on the left is in your hedge, it doesn't matter because they're not actually depositing those bacteria on your crops. You might have another group of birds that are commonly on your crops, but they're never carrying the pathogen. As long as they're not carrying the pathogen, then they're not going to make people sick. But when both of those things are occurring, that's when you need to be concerned about food safety. And so what we found is that it's a gradient. So there are more risky birds and less risky birds. And kind of the traits of birds that are more risky, those that are feedlot associated, and those that are commonly found on crops in large numbers. So this is things like invasive European starlings or native blackbirds. And then you have on the other side birds that are pretty low risk. So those are birds that are foraging at the top of the trees and aren't using the crops. So if you're at the treetops, you're probably not exposed to the bacteria, and you're probably not depositing it on the crops. And then also you can start to think about promoting birds of prey to scare off birds that might be more of an issue, like the American kestrel. I just want to briefly say that birds can also contaminate crops if they're contaminating irrigation water. So if you have an open source that you're using for irrigation, this is something to think about. I don't think there's any research that I know of that looks at how likely birds are to be causing foodborne illness through irrigation water contamination, but species like geese and mallards are known to carry foodborne pathogens, so just something to be aware of. So altogether, we know that bird feces can make people sick. There was in 2008 a foodborne illness traced back to migrating sandhill cranes, but this is the only foodborne illness outbreak that has definitively been traced back to birds. So it suggests that it's rare that birds are causing foodborne illness outbreak. Kind of a good rule of thumb, don't pick poopy produce. If you see poop, don't pick it. But thinking as well, there's definitely a risk gradient where feedlot associated birds like the invasive house sparrow shown in this photo, the feedlot associated birds are the worst. And the risk really depends on the context. So if you are near a feedlot and you have a lot of invasive birds, those birds are probably a higher risk. But if you're in a pretty forested area and you have birds like this orange-crowned warbler shown in the bottom photo, those birds are probably not a big risk to your farm, both because they're probably not carrying the pathogen and they're also not contacting the crops as much. So assessing the risk of birds to food safety depends on the context of your farm. So that was what I had prepared. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, perfect. So as before, you should have a quiz up on your screen for what Olivia, sorry for the missed eye there, what she covered today. And it's going to be a little bit more complex than the yes, no, but feel free to take your time in responding to that. And we did have a question that was just dropped into the chat. So yeah, reminder folks, if you have any questions for either of our speakers, feel free to plug those in now. And then also we'll have a chance if you want to share some of your experience too, we'll allow that too. So for now, we have this question from, if we have a healthy environment for birds, e.g. giving them ample uncontaminated food, such as with natural ecosystems, seeds and bugs, then the birds could be healthier and not become a carrier of pathogens, correct? So they're trying to think of this of like, if the birds and the environment is healthy, is there less likelihood of there being such foodborne pathogens present? And then, you know, as you can see in the end there, transferring to birds seems more pertinent to get the movement from, you know, across from different habitats and places. So what's your thoughts related to that, Olivia?
That is an interesting question that my research group was talking about a lot, and I'm not aware of any research that has specifically looked at it with foodborne pathogens. I think for foodborne pathogens, salmonella is one that is really bad for birds. I think it was last year there was a bad salmonella outbreak, particularly in the West Coast, where among birds and bird feeders. So that is a pathogen where it's really bad for birds. It causes rapid die-off. So in that case, healthier birds maybe would defend them a little bit against the bacteria. Campylobacter is thought to be a commensal of wild birds, meaning that like it's pretty neutral for them to have. It doesn't hurt or benefit them. So I think that's a really interesting question that I don't know that anyone has specifically looked at, but it's a hypothesis that would make sense.
Great, thank you. And we might as well, looks like folks are still working their way through the quiz. We'll give a little bit more time for that. And so I had a thought that maybe we can cover here, and that's the getting into those differences between on that chart where it's you had both the bird numbers and places as well as that Campylobacter. Yet the prevalence overall, can you put that percentage in perspective of even 8% for Campylobacter was the highest of these, but how does that compare more generally to food safety risks in other environments? Is 8% really a high number that was kind of higher than expected, or is that prevalence rate really within reason or even lower than what you would expect in other systems?
Yeah, it's the 8% is lower than what we had expected. A couple of years ago, we did a big synthesis across the literature where we looked at all the studies that have been conducted on birds in North America and how commonly it's, I think, 432 bird species that we looked at, so how commonly they're carrying these bacteria. And across the literature for Campylobacter, it was about 30%. So we're a lot lower, but a lot of the literature previously has looked at birds that were caught on feedlots or in cities or at a garbage dump. Like a lot of the prior research is really focusing on birds in pretty contaminated environments. So it seems like in these produce farming environments where we worked, there's a lot less overall contamination compared to where other people have looked before. And also a lot of it has focused on things like geese and starlings. So it's really the prior work, maybe it kind of overinflates what we think the risk is because it's really looking in these more contaminated places.
Great, thank you. Yes, because I think that's part of the clarification, right? That's important is birds in general can carry it, but yeah, understanding what those species are and if they're even likely to be present on your farm. So we're going to wrap up the quiz now. And so if you would like to cover what the correct responses were, that would be great.
Yeah, the first one, which farm would have the largest food safety issues from birds? Almost everyone got a produce farm next to a large feedlot. So for this answer, kind of your safest scenario based on our research is if you're in the middle of the forest. And then kind of the most risky seems to be if you're next to a feedlot, since the birds are getting the bacteria from the environment. And then also next to a feedlot, you probably have more birds like starlings. And then the second question, why are species like starlings and blackbirds more risky on average than species like warblers and flycatchers? The answer is all of the above. So first, they're picking up the bacteria from these contaminated environments. So that's the part looking at how frequently the birds are carrying bacteria. And then the other component is thinking about how much they're depositing those bacteria on crops. So the other ones also apply because they are also using the crops more. They're more agriculturally adapted than other species. And then there's also research showing that they'll move right between feedlots and produce. So pretty much anything that's more human associated environments, they love it. So all of the above apply.
Wonderful, thank you. So well done, folks, too. It looks like we had pretty resounding success with passing of our little quizzes here. So I'm going to just share my screen real quick because now we're going to step into this farm discussion Q&A period of time. So if folks have ever used the raised hand feature before, this is an opportunity for us, if you'd like to speak in your own voice and words, and maybe share some of your experience or frame a question on how you've come to coexist with birds on your farm, and potentially any food safety risks that you have come across in solutions. So feel free to use that feature, or you can plug things into the chat and then I will be sure to get those to our speakers. And so Rachel, if you'd like to turn your camera back on, I'm gonna stop the share here so that we can see all of our faces, and we'll see. I don't see any raised hands yet, but we did have another question here from Julie. They're wondering about the biosafety for chicken flocks once we have created hedgerows and nesting boxes. We have quite a group of folks in our district who have great concerns with wild birds near their flocks.
I'm actually not sure. Does anybody else know? Olivia, do you know by chance?
I was involved in a project looking at if birds might be spreading foodborne pathogens to chickens, and we're still kind of working on wrapping it up. I think there is a concern about it, like the person had asked the question, like it's definitely something people are thinking about and talking about, but I'm not sure if it's been very well demonstrated that it's the case. So I guess my response would be, I'm not sure if there's very robust evidence that birds are a problem for spreading bacteria to chickens.
Great, thanks. And then now we'll jump back to Rachel. In your discussion, you did bring up that that carbon sequestration point. So Joanne was asking if you could talk a little bit more about the 30%, 36% more carbon in the hedgerows than the crops, and what those values really mean.
Yeah, so just that that we sampled, I think it was like 15 different fields and different soil types, and then looked at the amount of carbon that was being sequestered in the hedgerows versus in the surrounding farmed areas, and found that the hedgerows are sequestering carbon, which is not a surprise because they have deep roots, and you have lots of microbial activity in those soils, and it's not being tilled. You have just a lot of plant biomass there versus the adjacent crops that are essentially disc and insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, just heavily farmed. And so this is good news for hedgerows, that I think that there's so much more work that still could be done in terms of that the below ground diversity is probably greater than what we're seeing in the above ground diversity, and I would love to see some more studies in that area. And so we submitted our paper to be published, and still hopefully that'll be out soon.
Fantastic, wonderful, thank you. And it looks like you also, Rachel, had a question for Olivia. So would you like to just ask that yourself?
Oh, just curious, Olivia, like feedlots seem to be a main source for the bird disease, not disease, I'm sorry, for just salmonella and other foodborne pathogens. And I was curious, what other sources are there out there?
Yeah, pretty much anything human associated. A lot of the literature has argued that urban environments are bad. So anywhere you have waste, essentially, like sewage treatment plants, a lot of times gulls will kind of forage in the area where there might be some wastewater. Water in general, like if you have a small pond, you might have geese that are moving pretty big areas between and taking bacteria. Like a landfill can also be a problem. With our work, we looked at, in our modeling, we considered livestock, urban, water, and across those, the cattle was the most important thing. So it seems like cattle are a bigger driver for at least these produce environments, but people kind of generally think anywhere that there are humans, there are bad bacteria.
Okay.
And so, and following up with that, right? So these are prevalence rates. Can you speak a little bit to the duration or period of time that maybe these pathogens may actually remain in the system?
Yeah, that's a really important question that people haven't really looked at very much. We, in our big review of the literature, really found a handful of studies that have looked at bacterial survival for the kind of main ones that birds are carrying. So Campylobacter seems to be the most fragile, so to speak, so it dies pretty quickly. There was one study that looked at survival in goose species, and it was about a week, and then the Campylobacter were no longer viable. For Salmonella and E. coli, the studies show that it could be a couple months at really low levels. We have a project right now with Danny Karp at UC Davis, who's talking, I think, next week, where we're inoculating bird feces with E. coli to see how long it's surviving. So we're doing some work now trying to follow up on it, but not much has been done. I guess from the little that we know, it seems that Campylobacter, the most common, is not very persistent, and then the really rare ones seem to be more persistent.
Great, thank you. So we did have a comment there that I think we can get to you, but thank you so much for that comment there, Augustin. I had a thought about, with Rachel, some of your work, how some of these habitats pull in certain bird species and kind of detract others, yet these habitats are just such small features. So I'm curious if you can speak to, do we necessarily want our farmscapes to have just these very small linear features? Or can you expand a little bit more about what would maybe a dream farmscape look like for you? Would there be more hedgerows?
Well, I just think that there's opportunities for planting hedgerows on all of our field edges. It just, it's we do need to produce food and for our growing world population, and yet we can produce food and yet protect and embrace our environment at the same time. And I think that we can do that by planting hedgerows on field edges, and so we don't want to take land out of production, and because we do need the food, and yet at the same time there are so many places out there where you can put these hedgerows that do make a difference in terms of providing these nature-based solutions to needs like pest control and pollination services that require huge inputs, and in terms of that we just need to make farms much more sustainable, so we're not relying on external input. So so I look around our our own lands, and there's there's like old fence rows and under power lines where we can put them. There's terraces left over from land leveling, which are very suitable. And I think the neat thing about hedgerows is that they do definitely attract in a lot of pollinators, a lot of natural enemies, a lot of good birds. They do export them into adjacent crops. And they're these the natural enemies, the bees, the birds, they're moving, distant into these crops. And one hedgerow that's say 1,000 feet long on an edge of a field will serve 2 40-acre parcels. So the more hedgerows we have out there, I think the better that we'll get these ecosystem services and less input into our farming systems. And I'm just really excited that just to see work like Olivia is doing and showing that that there's really there's they're not a big problem there for pathogens and pest birds and vertebrates and such, but we can coexist.
Right. Yeah, wonderful. And it looks like Joanne wants to jump in here. So please, Joanne, the Executive Director of Wild Farm Alliance.
Yeah, it's great, Rachel, to hear you talking about how important this field edges are and putting hedgerows in. And we have this campaign for hedgerows to the moon and back, where we'd like to see 500,000 miles planted in the US. But I actually had a question or comment for Olivia, because here where I live on the Central Coast, there are crops, leafy green crops grown close to sewage treatment plants. And so I wanted you to expound a little bit more on what you're finding with birds, and because some people may get really worried by your comment. So if we understand more about it, we could maybe not be so worried, or at least understand what and what you're still looking at.
Yeah, so what I mentioned it wasn't my primary research. It's based on the really early studies in literature, so I'm sure things have dramatically changed. So it's kind of like the 1960s or so. A bunch of people in the UK started looking at the risk of gulls carrying foodborne pathogens in these sewage treatment areas. So they were catching gulls in kind of these like affluents outside the plant, and then those gulls had higher salmonella when they were near the plants compared to when they were in other areas. So it's nothing that I've done, and I'm sure the world has vastly changed since then, but there was some of the early literature on gulls in particular.
Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Yes, thank you. And so now we're going to kind of jump into the wrap-up stage of today's lesson. So as we're kind of going to do a little recap, I want to ask each of you if you had just some like last little takeaways that you want to leave with folks. And then there should be what's labeled survey 2 up on everyone's screen now. So this poll is really important too, because this helps us with kind of seeing overall, how do we do today? Hopefully we provided some wonderful and useful information for you. So I'll leave it up to either Rachael or Olivia if you have any last little takeaways that you want to leave with folks with.
Oh gosh, Joanne, can you address the question about how people can have advocacy for this for really promoting the habitat on farms? Did you see that question?
Oh, I did, let's see.
Yeah, what we can do is I'll let you, Rachael and Olivia, you can give your little wrap ups, and then at the very end, we can speak a little bit to that and direct folks to some additional resources. But thank you for pointing that out, Rachael.
Did we want to go ahead and talk while?
Sure. Why don't you guys wrap up and then we can say a few words after.
So I just really appreciate this opportunity to share this research that I've been doing for the past 30 years on the benefits of hedgerows on farms. And we started in the 90s with not knowing much, and now we know, that you do get huge benefits, and that we're not trying to take any land out of production. We need farming, we need food, and so there's lots of opportunities for putting a habitat on farms without taking any land out of production, and getting these huge benefits from this field edge habitat. So thank you.
I don't have a specific end note prepared, but thanks everyone for coming, and it was exciting to share research with all of you.
Yes, as we all know, right, this is a work in progress, and research is always being done. And the lesson takeaways often is that it's nice to synthesize this information, right? So the more layers of benefits we can build on insects and birds and mammals and pollinators, the stronger case can really be made, right? So thank you so much for both of your work. We can now, we'll leave that survey up for a little bit longer, but we wanted to, of course, mention that this is lesson 6 of a 10 lesson series that we are putting on. So our next lesson will be in 2 weeks. And that's when we're going to start transitioning into focusing in on birds and different bird species and what their strategies and approaches are and the benefits that they could provide for farmers. And that Wild Farm Alliance, we have a wealth of knowledge and resources that we've been trying to get out to folks. And so please visit our website. We have recordings for all of our previous lessons, including today's. We have a resources page where you can find literature that was covered both in today's presentations as well as extra information. And that at the end of the day, the more folks know about this and the easier it is to share, the better we all are. So Joanne, if you wanted to wrap things up with kind of helping with that question above that was asking about how can we get the word out. And we had a comment about with hedgerows and what sorts of guilds and things, I would recommend to them, we'll reach out to you after today, but I recommend to join us for our next few lessons, because we'll start diving in more specifically to these habitat features.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. The question was, how can consumers help? And Shelley answered that you should talk to your farmer, especially if you're at farmers market. Talk to them about how you would really love for them to be supporting pollinators and beneficial insects and birds, and ask them if they are, and that just reinforces any good practices they are doing and helping them to think that that could be a good thing for them to do. Also, as Shelley pointed out, the Farm Bill is coming up again, and that's policy that we really need a lot of help with. We'll be sending email action alerts out where you can encourage your representatives to support the right kind of farm bills. But then just in general, when you're out looking at agriculture, start to look for the farms that have habitat, that are really protecting the soil, supporting the pollinators and birds and other wildlife that helps our world function. Because as you educate yourself, you can educate others about what a good farm looks like, what a farm looks like that can help us move into the future and thrive, hopefully. So all those things can help move the needle forward or around.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you. So that'll wrap up today's lesson. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one. And as always, try and keep it wild on your farms.